Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Welcome to the Childhood Violence Fragile Societies, the case for investing in violence prevention. Thank you very much for coming to this session. My name is Charlotte McLean-Intlapo, and I'm the Disability Advisor for the World Bank Group. I do recognize that throughout this forum there are a lot of competing interests and very interesting sessions happening concurrently, so we really do appreciate the turnout here this morning. So I would like to start off this session by providing some framing remarks and then quickly pivot to my panel. And just by way of an introduction, I note that conflict has long-lasting impacts on societies, and an aftermath which entails decades of rebuilding, reconstruction that's both economic and social, physical, but perhaps most importantly, psychological. The killing of children is seen as a symbol of terrible depths to which conflict, whatever its source, can plague a community and humanity. The consequences of conflict on children, whether as observers or participants or targets, beyond the loss of life, are increasingly well understood to include not just the loss of livelihood and home, but very more importantly, the long-term psychological effects of trauma. And importantly, given that we are at the World Bank, the vast economic costs that's associated with this kind of trauma. When these costs have been estimated, and I emphasize the when because this is not, we don't have enough research and data in relation to this, but when they are estimated, for instance, in a recent ODI study, the estimates are that the global economic impacts and costs of resulting from the consequences of physical and psychological and sexual violence against children can be as high as $7 million. And so those numbers are really high. The massive cost is higher than the investment required to prevent such violence. And I think for me, that's a really important piece going ahead this morning, that, you know, investing in the prevention of violence is really our long-term plan. The annual global costs of the worst forms of child labor are approximately $97 billion. And those resulting from children's association with armed forces or groups can be up to $144 million annually. So these figures are vast. And again, I think we need to think about how we begin to collect more robust data in relation to this. This deep intergenerational cycle of violence indicates the importance of placing the central focus on children. When children experience violence and live in societies that are on the edge, it can be assumed that without considerable investments in preventing violence that's faced in their homes, in their schools, in their institutions, on playgrounds, in public spaces, they will grow up as adults without the appropriate skills and capabilities to reverse fragility. And so I think for me, thinking about this, and again, as part of the prevention is really important. It is also important to acknowledge that at the outset, violence experienced during armed conflict is at the extreme spectrum of violence encountered by children. I think we need to recognize when we think about violence that millions of children endure violence on a day-to-day basis. And so it's not just the extremes of children in conflict, but it's children in their homes. It's punishment that children often receive that is extremely violent. And I think this is well articulated in the UNICEF 2014 report called Hidden in Plain Sight. Recent assessments suggest that civilians, and amongst them children, are increasingly casualties of armed conflict. And estimates from the now almost decade-old report, the Grassa-Machel report on children in conflict in a changing world, suggest that more than 1 billion children under the age of 18 were living in areas of conflict or engaged in war, 300 million of whom were under the age of 5, with a further 18 million children internally displaced or refugees. This report is almost 10 years old, as I said, but if we think of the world today, and we think of the conflict in the world today, I think these numbers could look significantly different. So, ladies and gentlemen, enough said from me. What I would like to do now is to just briefly acknowledge the panel, and then I will ask the panel individually, or the speakers on the panel individually, to say a few words. So today we have 5 panelists that bring a really rich and diverse set of experiences and expertise, and so I'm really excited a privilege to be able to chair this panel. And I'll start from my left, going right, and to just introduce quickly Susan Pissell. I'll ask each one of them to say a bit about where they come from and what they do before they answer their questions. So welcome, Susan. And then we have Shelley Whitman. Shelley, thank you for coming. Welcome very much. We have Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire. Thank you, General, very much for coming. Shiv Kumar, thanks, Shiv. And then we have Cornelius Williams, all of whom will say a few words about where they come from. I also would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the presence of Sunita Azeldeha. Sunita, I will ask to say a few words once the panel has had a bit to say. So without further ado, I will start with General Dallaire. And General, let me just start off by acknowledging your experience firsthand in Rwanda, and being witnessed and engaged in observing the brutalities that come out of fragile societies. So looking at fragility and the social collapse from the perspective of children, in your view, what are the key issues that we need to understand from the experience of brutal conflict? And I think related to that, to give us a sense of what drives the violence and how does it affect children?
Charlotte asked us to be brief, yet the question begs about an hour and a half of lecture. I will do the impossible for a retired general, and that's my background, to respond succinctly. I am now the founder of the Romeo Dallaire Child Soldier Initiative at Dalhousie University that's dedicated to the eradication of the use of children as weapons of war, child soldiers. And so that's the thrust that I have taken that did start, yes, in the Rwandan genocide, where a youth wing of a political party, which was very positive and engaged youth in all kinds of very positive social activities and sports activities and cohesion and esprit de corps, and gave a sense of pride to young people, was able to very subtly but very deliberately and progressively, with the use of radio and so on, to shift that body into an active, murderous militia that ultimately conducted the bulk of the slaughter in Rwanda. The same youths, but completely shifting gears. And what we have seen since then, and the factors that are engaged, is that we now have in the world over 50 conflicts where there's not one conflict that doesn't have child soldiers as a primary weapon system of the conflict. Not as a peripheral add-on, but as a primary entity of the conflict, and sustains the conflict by the demographics and their availability, and is a sign of possible recidivism because the youth are so influenced by the experience of 3-4 years, sometimes more, in conflict zones and being part of the actual conflict resolution, which is the fighting forces. The concept of volunteerism, which I think we want to touch upon because they see themselves flung into a conflict situation in an imploding nation, a failing state, a civil war. The concept of them fundamentally being volunteers to become child soldiers is grossly erroneous, because they're doing it under a duress of being in a conflict zone. And that seems often to be lost in the fact that they're not really volunteering because the country is not in a normal state. The country is in a conflict state. And so it is for self-protection and a variety of other reasons that they end up in that, let alone being abducted. And so no such thing as a child soldier volunteer in the context of what we would consider volunteer exists. It is done under duress, whether they realize it or not, because of the scenario that exists. And so the counteraction to that is prevention of recruitment of child soldiers. And that's why we have concentrated on two things. One, in the education system, of making them aware of what that could happen and how they can get themselves brought into those processes as a solution. But the other one is to engage the security sector actors right up front in the process of reducing and preventing the recruitment of child soldiers by the fact that they're often the first ones that the children see in the streets and in the different areas. And because of that, they are right in face-to-face communications continuously with the children. And so they, the security sector actors, police and military, are, in our opinion, the body that we are concentrating enormously in changing their doctrinal, their sort of ethos in regards to children, and making the level of respect and protection of children a component of their responsibilities. And I would say that that's sort of an opening gambit.
Thank you very much, General. And thank you very much for emphasizing the importance of the prevention of recruitment of child soldiers, and the absolute necessity to engage the security sector in the beginning. And I think that really is a very important piece. I think this is a great segue to pivot to our next speaker, Cornelius. And Cornelius, as the chief of UNICEF's child protection work globally, we know that you've been working on the issue of children's rights, in particular around their access to identity documents, to access to social services and social assistance, which become obviously more critical in fragile societies and settings. And I was wondering, if in your opinion, what can be the key entry points to intervene early for children in fragile societies? And then, given that, what is UNICEF's approach to prevention?
Thank you very much, actually. Let's start with the issue of identity document. We have seen crises where an identity and citizenship drives the crisis. We saw it in Cote d'Ivoire, we saw it in South Sudan, and Sudan, we've seen it in several fragile societies, Myanmar, several countries around the world. One of the things is actually we have to ensure that the civil registration system, there is investment in the civil registration system because it's a breeder document, and that we have a strong institution that recognizes and it builds on the issue of between the contract between a citizen and the state, and that they're part of the state. And so the beginning is the birth registration certificate. And to have that your birth registered and to have a certificate would provide you access to, one, your rights as a citizen, and two, for you to engage as a member of the society and to have a vested interest in not eroding the society and to be a member of the society. And so it's a two-way. Okay, you're recognized as a citizen, and the state provides you with services, and you have an allegiance to the society, the state and your society, because you have that document. So investing in the system and not doing ad hoc projects is one of the issues. Now, we have seen investment prior to the conflict or a society becoming more fragile, and post-conflict, there have been investment in getting these systems up and running. That's one of the issues. The other issue is, which I would touch on, is actually, and again, actually, we have seen how important the civil registration system is in fragile society in documenting human rights issue. Right? I don't know how many of you knew about it, but in one country where there was a riot, it got to a point they couldn't bury the people who were being killed because they didn't have birth certificate, right? And they had to get more people to do the birth certificate to bury the people who were being killed by the security forces, right? And they were being killed extrajudiciary. So it became an issue. And then the issue is actually you can go back years back and document all this. Now, moving on to the social assistant, actually, and we believe that actually you should invest in a child protection system. A child protection system actually is a system that would provide support to children who have suffered from violence. Now, you can invest before a society becomes fragile and post-conflict. Let us take a country like Sierra Leone, right, where Sierra Leone went through a conflict, it got into post-conflict, it was still fragile, it had the Ebola, and what was found out was that the investment in the child protection system was not, has not been maintained. There was massive investment during the conflict, and after the conflict, the investment dropped off. And if the investment had been sustained, then the child protection system would have responded to the children who were affected by Ebola. So one of the things we're saying is you have the entry point during conflict, not only to look at children who become separated, or like the general said, children who were released from armed forces and groups, providing programs for them, but as you invest in these programs, you have to think of the system.
Thanks, Cornelius. And I think a number of messages, but for me, two key points around that is the importance of birth registration, both as a tool to ensure that people are engaged in society, but also as a tool to ensure access to services. And then for highlighting the importance of investing in child protection systems, having a benefit not just for the child, but really for society and for the country at large. The next speaker is Shiv Kumar. And Shiv, I'd like you to perhaps just think about how do we build a prevention strategy? What would this entail? What are your thoughts in relation to the key elements or building blocks that would be needed to build such a strategy?
Thank you. My name is Shiv Kumar, and I'm the co-chair of a global learning initiative. It's called No Violence in Childhood, KNOW is the word. And over the 2 years, we've been in existence for a little over a year. We're gathering evidence that is available to make a very strong case for preventing violence in childhood. Thank you for these comments by the other two speakers. I just want to make a few opening remarks. First is that in discussions about countries faced with conflict, there is a growing awareness about the need to adopt a gender lens. Yesterday I was in a panel session here where it was pointed out that the needs of women are very different from that of men, that coping strategies differ, and that women face circumstances that are unique. This is indeed true, but very often children tend to be left out. And here we need to look at children not as a homogeneous group, but clearly recognize how children get affected depends greatly on their gender, of course, whether it's a boy or a girl, and equally important on their age. So how old the child is really matters. And so from that point of view, it is commendable that the bank has supported such a panel on violence prevention in fragile societies. Perhaps it's a recognition that unless we invest in preventing violence in childhood, all the investments that the world is making in terms of promoting, expanding opportunities and accelerating development may not be sustainable. Second, I think it's important to recognize that even in countries that are not faced with conflict, there are zones and regions where children experience very similar conditions of hostility and brutality. This happens, for instance, where gang violence is high, or even where bullying in schools is a common occurrence. So the point I'm making is that violence in childhood is quite universal. It occurs in rich countries as much as it does in poor countries, though the forms may differ. And this has a few policy implications. First, obviously, it is not a question of resources or how wealthy a nation is. And so the rich countries cannot really get smug and say that we are fine and we have the resources to deal with this. They need to be ever so vigilant about watching out for violence in childhood. And the second important lesson is that poor countries do not have to wait to become rich to do something about violence prevention, because there are a number of countries that are income poor in that sense, but where rates of even homicide are much lower than in many developed countries. Let me make 2 or 3 quick comments on prevention, building blocks for prevention. First is from our own study of over the last 1 year, we find that violence in childhood cannot be addressed but cannot be prevented by addressing merely the symptoms. To give an example, we cannot end bullying in schools by merely focusing on or targeting school children and school teachers, because what we find is that what happens in schools is strongly influenced by what happens within the family. And so when a child witnesses, for instance, domestic violence at home, he's much more likely to display aggressive behavior in schools. And what happens in schools is also influenced by what happens in the communities around which in which the school is situated. So if violence is common in public spaces, it also has an adverse effect on behavior of children in schools. So what we are really advocating for is need for integrated approaches that bring together the interventions in different settings onto integrated delivery platforms. Second, we find that levels of, while we are looking at the microdynamics of specific contexts, whether it's a family, whether it's a school, whether it is in community spaces, it is also important to focus on macro structural factors that have a bearing on violence in childhood. And here I would particularly point to aspects of poverty, deprivation, exclusion, discrimination, and inequality. For instance, the evidence suggests that at a macro level, lower levels of violence are associated with more positive aspects of human development. Rates of homicide, for example, tend to be lower in countries that invest more in health, education, social security, that have stable political systems, and that are less likely to violate human rights. Another significant factor is inequality. A recent study of 169 countries found that in low and middle income countries, the rates of homicide, robbery, and self-reported assault were lower in countries with lower levels of inequality. So in other words, while we're looking at the micro settings, we also have to dialogue, if you're looking at serious about violence prevention, with policymakers who are addressing the broader macro questions of economic and social policy. The last point I would make is that to tackle violence, we need to get to the root causes, address risk factors, and stop it before it starts. We have to acknowledge that human experience is shaped early in childhood. The exposure to violence, witnessing it, the social sanction, the impunity, all have impacts on formative experiences with very strong intergenerational consequences. And so this brings me to the last point. As an economist, I think Charlotte did talk about the estimates of costs running into millions and trillions. We also have Stiglitz, who has this famous book called The $3 trillion War, which he said is the true cost of the Iraq conflict. But we must recognize that all these methodologies are greatly flawed, and even in the $3 trillion estimate, which he, by the way, later revised last year to $4 trillion because he said that he had underestimated lifetime disability benefits, the real human cost to children, American children, and the Iraqi families and Iraqi children are really not factored in. So while we do make an economic case, we must recognize that the time today is to make a very strong moral argument. We need an ethical framework based on human development, expansion of choices for children and vulnerable families that recognizes that violence is related to dignity, it's an affront to dignity, and it's morally repugnant. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shiv, and thank you for reminding us that violence in childhood is universal, because I think we often kind of step back and we think of it as something happening in conflict areas, and I think it's really important for us to remember that. It seems like there's clearly a thread going through all the speakers, and that's the importance of investing in violence prevention. And then I think just, your point around ensuring that there are integrated approaches, and very importantly, linked to that, integrated delivery platforms. So the approach needs to have a platform that is indeed integrated. And then I think the factors that you spoke about, like poverty, inequality, and deprivation, are all very real ones, and certainly issues that we are challenged with here at the bank. So I'm going to go with the second round of questions, but what I am going to do right now is to maybe just pivot to Shelley, who's sitting here on the panel with us, and just ask you, Shelley, briefly to think about, given what you've heard from the speakers, who do you think are the key audiences? Who should we be speaking to? Who are the key audiences?
Thanks, Charlotte. I think absolutely that what everyone has said here highlights different audiences. So whether that's from the security sector, as General Dallaire is talking about, in terms of us looking at those who are to be the protectors, be it the military, the police, all of those angles that we have to address, ministers of defense, etc., government leaders, prime ministers, presidents, those around the world need to take a leadership on this issue. So many of the systemic problems that Cornelius was pointing to in terms of basic rights, like access to being able to have a birth certificate, those things have to be thought of in terms of what is the bigger framework for protecting children in terms of all of those systems of governance that we have, from the United Nations itself to regional bodies to governments. Where do we place this on the priority scale? We tend to put children at the bottom of the agenda in most of the things that we're addressing, from peace agreements to mandates to how we function in terms of funds that we allocate for education to healthcare to aspects related to child protection overall. But it needs to be given a far higher priority on the agenda to be thought of in terms of preventing violence overall. So when we think about conflicts and we think about domestic situations in our own countries, for example, Shiva was absolutely correct when he's saying none of us are immune to this, and we have seen this more and more, the interconnectedness of violence across our particular developed countries to those that are less developed. It's no longer them and us. We're all in this together. It's connected. So if you look at a conflict like Syria, as an example, it has brought home that element that the conflict that is happening there is intimately connected to our own young people and youth in this context as well. So we have to do a better job of positioning this as a key element to every decision that we make in terms of where we're putting budget, resources, etc. And I don't think we've done enough to do that. It also means we have to think about breaking these cycles of violence from the perspective of understanding that this isn't just about adding in a specific program, as we were discussing earlier. It's about really understanding what are the drivers of the root causes that lead to these violent behaviors, and how do we address that. So it requires a much more holistic conversation. I mean, it's interesting as I look out here, thinking of the backgrounds of everybody that is in here, and the work that we conduct with the Romeo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative, we're often speaking to audiences who don't think necessarily that things such as child protection are in their purview. So the chiefs of defense staffs, the ministers of defense, etc. But what we pitch to them is that absolutely this is a part of your mandate. And so we have to change that, where those conversations stop siloing this work. This is integral to all of us in terms of humanity and peace overall around the world.
Thank you, Shelley, for just really underscoring the fact that it really is everybody's business and everybody should be engaged in it in an integral way. Susan, I'm not ignoring you. I will come back to you to make some final comments at the end of the discussion. I'd like to see if Sonita is still in the room. Yes, you are. I can't see you, sorry. So Sonita is from Afghanistan, and Sonita is a rapper, I understand. But I do have a question for you, Sonita. And I'm not putting her on the spot. I asked her before, so, you know. So, Sunita, if you could just maybe give us your thoughts about if marrying girls, if marrying young girls, in your mind, is a form of violence. Or do you see it as violence? Do you want to come up to the mic?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Sonita. I'm from Afghanistan, and I was almost a child bride. So I think child marriage is a violence against children because it hurts their bodies, their minds, and destroys their childhoods from them. Parents, they love their children, but if they do that to their children because they don't know another way. And I know it's the biggest problem, and I believe that it can be done.
Thank you, Sunita, for sharing that. And I think you raised a really important aspect there, and that is that, you know, we often make assumptions, right, that parents are marrying their children off because they're bad, because they're evil. But I think your point is that often parents do that because they don't have any alternative. So how do we create alternatives for parents? And how do we ensure that there's education and therefore the changing of social norms to ensure that parents are not, in fact, marrying off their brides, rather their children, their children. And I'd like to open the floor up for questions. If you have a question, could you please come up to the mic? I see this. Oh, yeah. Or if it's not convenient for you, just raise your hand and somebody will bring the mic to you. There you go. If you could just say who you are and where you come from, that would be great.
My name is Patty Strong, and I work with the Canadian Red Cross. My question is for Cornelius with respect to civil registration and vital statistics. There's been an enormous push in my country with my government, in particular internationally, to increase the registration of children, and we understand for the reasons that you have stated why it's important, and for many other reasons as well, our ability to track our impact on the lives of children. At the same time, many contexts in which we have worked, you and I have worked together, there are populations, communities with legitimate fears of registration, often minority communities. And so my question is, how do we balance that very real need, the right of children to be registered, with the legitimate concerns that communities may have in being fearful to register? And at the same time, how do we ensure that a lack of registration doesn't result in a denial of services to children and their families? Thank you.
Excellent question. I'll take a few. Oh, gosh. Yeah, all right. I'll take a few.
My name is Matthew Scott. I'm Director of Peacebuilding with World Vision, and I appreciated the comments, Cornelius, about child protection systems being key to the prevention challenge. The additional challenge of setting up those systems in fragile contexts especially is the merging of informal and formal child protection systems. I wonder if you could share a few more successful experiences, if you have them, of how to bridge the gap between informal child protection systems, which are often the only ones that can really thrive in fragile contexts, and the formal ones that might be nascent or incipient from fragile states themselves.
Another question?
Good morning. My name is Evelyn Tomaszewski. I'm with the National Association of Social Workers. And thank you very much for taking my question. This is perhaps to all of the panelists, but I've heard the connection of talking about child protection systems really to me is an element of health systems. And I think that connecting the need to strengthen health systems and social service systems is not something that is commonly thought about. I think it's an emerging discussion, and I'm really wondering if anyone on the panel could address how we can get that dialogue going at a more serious and consistent level.
Can I get one more question and then I'll come back for another round?
Yes. My name is Marcelo Cork. I'm with the Pan American Health Organization. And the question is for Shiv, since you mentioned about the gender explicit approach that should be. I will go a step further because I think that is what do you think about the hidden issues of violence regarding children becoming adolescents and with their sexual identity in societies, particularly where they identify themselves as gay or lesbians or transsexuals, and therefore the hidden cases of violence as well. And combined with that, societies that do not try to expose the children with disabilities since their birth, and they keep them in their homes, and that as a way of violence. And I think that those cases of hidden violence is even worse than what we explicitly see worldwide, because we don't know what we don't know. Thank you.
Okay, that was an excellent set of questions. And Cornelius, I'll start off with you and then come down the panel. If you want to speak to the issue around populations with legitimate fears around registration, the question from Patty.
Yes, thank you, Patty. I mean, history has shown how a national registration and identity management process can be used to persecute minority groups or groups who are excluded from society. And it's the way society has conceptualized in countries groups who are excluded, and it feeds into and bleeds into all the systems, not only the registration systems, but the services. And we have around the world excluded group. One of the things actually we usually would advise is that when a registration system is being set up, you need to look at the legislation. So the registration system is being set up, you need to look at the legislation around it. If you look at some of the birth registration systems, there are boxes where you would identify groups. And it's the danger of identifying these groups, and you have to advocate that this is taken out, actually. And it's two, we also have to make sure that actually the overall, the society recognize the need for cohesion, right? And then the independence of the registration system, and not to use the registration system as a tool for oppression. There are a lot of people who go into civil registration feeling it's a politically neutral system. It is not a politically neutral system. It is fraught with politics, and the power dynamics have to be recognized, and advocacy has to be done. And this registration system, if it's not done well, can lead to an identity crisis and can contribute to violence rather than mitigate the violence. So then the denial of services definitely can be used to exclude groups or to include groups. So it's positive if you know how to use it, and it can be used in a negative manner. And the history is full of how it's been used. The issue of setting up the informal child protection system, we have experience in setting up informal child protection system. Societies everywhere in the world have structures. Colleagues who do anthropology would tell you that all societies have a way of taking care of their children. Modern, in infancy, the Aborigines, national, they have a way of taking care. How do we identify these structures and make sure that the structures is docked into a modern system? That's the challenge. And we have had the challenge, and we have done it successfully by using community approaches and working with these fragile systems in countries like Somalia, I mean, all over the world where there's fragile system, using community approaches to strengthen the system, identifying these systems, strengthen the system, train the system, and then in the post-conflict, doing the investment, right? So when the investment is going into the social sector, there should be investment in the social welfare workforce. Then there should be investment in the social welfare structures and the ministry and the social assistance and social protection systems that is being developed. And connecting to the health and the social, child protection systems, there is the child protection system. It's made up, it links into the health sector, it links into the education sector, and you have to look at who is the workforce and what are the different competences that is required. And we have done that in mapping child protection system in several countries. And when we map it, then you would see who's responsible and who has the obligation to provide these services to children.
Thank you for raising that question on hidden issues. In fact, one of the things that we are finding when we are looking at evidence in this global learning initiative is the absence of data itself. And even if you look at the numbers of countries that report in the UNICEF report, you'll find blanks across several forms of abuse and several countries. And one of the things is that fear, stigma, social acceptance of what is abuse or not abuse is a major factor that results in this underreporting. And when it comes to issues of sexual identity and so on, it is a very, very serious problem. So the way we are addressing it in the initiative is to say that yes, numbers are important, but numbers can tell us only a partial story. And therefore, when you talk about evidence, these numbers have to be supplemented by effective descriptions and narratives that really capture the condition of different groups of children facing different kinds of exploitation and abuse. So I completely agree with that, and in our report we do have references or discussions on these hidden issues.
General Della? Chatting?
That I don't want to comment on health systems, but it's kind of the point that I was trying to make, that no matter what system you have, whether it's health, security, protection, whatever, the interconnectedness of those has to be more serious, absolutely, not just an add-on issue that we put into the agenda. But on the hidden levels of violence, particularly when you're commenting about youth, I mean, these are the critical issues, not just on the gender and disabilities, but in terms of overall, we need to understand aspects related to shame, stigma, and fear that exist across the board, and how we need to do better to try to understand those are drivers of violence, absolutely.
Can we take another set of questions? There's a young woman here who's had her hand up from the get-go. So, young in the blue dress, and then Jillian, and then the woman in the green headscarf. We'll take a couple.
Thank you. My name is Tang Degfe, and I'm from Wellspring Advisors. My question is for Mr. Williams. You mentioned about having children registered in the civil registry system as a way or as a key way of making sure that they're protected. But my question is, when you look at a lot of countries that are going through a crisis, these registration systems are basically destroyed. So I don't think there will be any systems existing. So what's your alternative? I don't expect you to know it from the top of your head at this point, but what's the alternative for countries that don't even have a registration system because of conflicts? Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Gillian Hubner, and I'm approaching this question basically from 7 years working with the U.S. government and trying to influence a little bit the congressional allocations for specific issues. So just this week, I was reviewing the budget requests for 2017, the fiscal year, and I'm very interested to see how this is broken down. So in the past 20 years, we've reduced child mortality by 70%, which is a huge testament to focused and dedicated resources, collaboration from public-private partners and whatnot. Now we're down to 5.9 children under 5 not reaching their 5th birthdays. That's a pretty low child mortality rate compared to what it used to be. Now we have 1 billion children suffering from violence and 0 allocations in the U.S. government budget for violence prevention. The CDC, which has been leading the violence against children surveys and globally and has developed a comprehensive program for violence reduction, has 0 allocations from the government. You've never seen the violence against children surveys mentioned in a congressional budget. I think it would be really helpful as a sector if we can break down what are our requests, what is UNICEF budgeting toward this versus what they're budgeting toward child mortality. What are we budgeting in the World Bank for violence prevention versus what we are budgeting for other areas. And I think that is really helpful for advocates, those of us who are beating our heads against the door in Congress and whatnot, if we actually have some comparative numbers, and also then what the needs are and what precisely we would do if we got, say, 10% of what the child mortality sector gets. What could we do? What results would we expect to see?
Hi, my name is Asma. I'm a research fellow from Gaza. My question is to the general. You mentioned how active young people has turned to child soldiers and how they were a tool for violence. Now, my question is, do you think, what were the drivers other than the violence that is in their community that drove them from, instead of being an active and positive force in their community, to go to the other side and be a violent tool? And do you think that education and schools, if they created a safe space for young people, could tackle this issue and would tackling the mental health of seeing, for example, your family being murdered could be also a positive force in tackling this or not? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question. And this is really difficult. If you can all promise to be really concise in your questions, we can then maybe do all 4 hands. But please be concise. I'll start with the lady here in the red.
We're seeing this in the States in minor ways, but in Central America where I work, I think it's a major driver of tension between children and parents that even, I think, can be linked into the support of parents for repressive policies, that hardline policies of governments towards gangs. Can you just pass the mic down?
Hi, I'm David Stephen from the Centre on International Cooperation at NYU, and also working with the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. I wanted to pick up on the point that's just been made and address this to Shiv mainly. I mean, I think we need, when we talk about the case for investing in violence prevention, I think we need to start talking to policymakers about what they're losing in terms of the investment they're making in education, child health or nutrition, how they're losing return from that, and how the cost of violence is diverting investment from long-term investments in human capital and infrastructure. I think that's a much more direct way of talking to people who think in dollar signs, and I wonder if there's evidence that we can use on that. And similarly, partners including the World Bank, WHO are beginning to work on a package of evidence-based violence prevention solutions. And I think we have an opportunity to look at each of those solutions and say, what is the return on investment if we're to put money into each of those areas on their own? And then what do we get if we invest in them all together at once? So again, I'd be interested to know what kind of evidence we have on returns of investment for violence prevention. Thank you.
Okay, over here, David. Yeah. Right in the back, the lady. Yeah. Right in the back. Please keep your questions quick.
I'll be quick. Stephanie Belliard, I'm with the Canadian government. I'm interested in the linkages between violence in children's education and political violence. This is very culturally sensitive, how children get beaten at home and in school, and how this can degenerate further in their life into social and political violence. So just a general question, if panelists can address this as well. Thank you.
So Rosemary, the last question, and then we'll ask the panel. That's the 1 minute, please.
My name is Rosemary Seger. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on conflicts and violence. We held a conference on Capitol Hill in 2009, focusing on conflicts and child soldier. I just have a flyer here on Bring Our Girls Back. These were the Nigerian children who were adopted in Nigeria. What is this prevention, or what would we say this, and what can be done to avoid this protection? Because that's why we are all here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being all so quick and succinct. I'm going to start off with General Dallaire to respond to some of the questions posed, particularly in relation to children in conflict.
We're engaged very much in the front end of the catastrophic scenarios in which we're using children as instruments of war. I mean, this goes beyond gangs. This goes beyond just non-state actors. In fact, it engages still 7 state actors around the world, and conflicts are being sustained by the presence of the use of children. So it is not just the fact that you have some, but in fact the demographics and the way that the adults are using, belligerents are using children, are seeing that as an instrument to sustain these forces and to also be able to move very rapidly in mobilizing these children into forces that can in fact degenerate into conflict. So you've got a tool that can be shifted very rapidly under duress, but shifted very rapidly into the extreme scenario of being pushed to the extent where even the recruitment of child soldiers could be brought into line with the prevention of mass atrocities and genocide, because I would argue that recruiting children to conduct war is certainly an early warning system of people ready to go to other extremes, including mass atrocities and genocide. The Gaza point was very appropriate. It's fine to have the schooling systems, and yes, we are engaged in parallel in the schools and pedagogical tools and the like to help children to be prevented from getting recruited and so on. But if there's no security to the school is nothing more than a target, which comes back to Nigeria and that school there. I mean, it wasn't as if people didn't know that that school was, in fact, vulnerable. And so not providing an atmosphere of security for the children only puts them into the front lines of wanting to establish that security by the fact that they're so easily recruited and so numerous. And so we're pushing them into violence by not being able to establish that atmosphere that will permit them to go to school, and first of all, to get to school, and secondly, to be able to have a certain serenity that when they're coming back from school, let alone the time at school, they can actually study. And my last point, if I may, is on the U.S. side, that it is high time to start putting money into prevention. This weapon system is cheap, but it is catastrophic. It is 160,000 kids with machetes is an instrument of mass atrocity and an instrument of mass destruction. And so not being able to prevent the recruitment and the use of children is an area of enormous significance to permitting a country to advance and not waste massive assets on things like having to introduce UN missions and all kinds of other means that way. So there's a lot of work that can be done there and a lot of cheap investment and a lot of people saved.
Thank you, General. So, Cornelius, if you could just talk quickly about the alternative registration systems.
Usually all societies, again, have a way of identifying identity management. And what we would do is after a conflict, there is usually a campaign to get people to have access to their identity document and build up their identity document systems again. Right.
Shiv, if you could speak to David's comment, please.
Thank you. I think if there's a single message that is coming out of our own analysis is that violence is preventable. If little has been done so far by governments and societies, it is not because they appreciate or like violence. It is because many of them have not thought about it. Many of them are not aware of the consequences, and there's a lot of scientific evidence that points to both the immediate and intergenerational consequences. Many of them are not aware of what needs to be done, even when they recognize that there is so much violence in society. And finally, they don't realize that prevention has many, many positive benefits, both in terms of the constitutive benefits, in terms of what it does to the life of a child and the immediate family, but also the consequential benefits to society, which have extraordinary gains to reap as a whole.
Shirley, any thoughts?
Quickly say that the point you brought up about the Nigerian situation, you asked whether it's prevention or not. When we're putting out a hashtag bring back our girls, we've already gone past the prevention element, right? 2 years later, when we still have to put all of this effort into a campaign to do so is not what we want to be doing, although it's necessary right now. I think what General Dallaire was pointing to is that actually we knew we had early warning, we could have known, we could have done more on this. There are many instances. I mean, that instance replicates what happened with the Lord's Resistance Army 20 years before that. So we have knowledge on how to do these things better, but we don't actually apply it because we don't make it a priority.
Thank you very much. And so I'm now going to ask Susan to close out this morning's conversation by sharing some of your own reflections, Susan, on where do you think we are in terms of the field of violence prevention in childhood, and what needs to be done, what more needs to be done in that regard, and then what are some of the political and policy decisions that we need to be thinking about going ahead. So over to you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Charlotte. I want to also acknowledge the bank for hosting us here during the Fragility Forum. I wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago that we could fill a room on this subject, and you're not all my friends. I don't know many of you, so that's a very good sign. And thanks for giving me the closing remarks. It's been hard for me to sit here and be quiet. For those of you who know me, I'm fidgeting not because of the coffee, but because I'm impatient to get on with this agenda that we have been, I think many of the people in this room, I see, well, I won't name you by names, but Michelle, I see you back there Together for Girls, and Gary, Cure Violence, Jillian, your long work, Michael Gibbons right in front of me, Rolf Carrier, my boss from my days in Bangladesh 20 years ago. I think that the negotiations over Agenda 2030 and the new Sustainable Development Goals are a stark illustration that, in fact, the world is impatient about this issue of violence. Goal 16 talks about peaceful and inclusive societies, and there was a big debate about that goal, but there was no debate about Target 16.2 and keeping children safe from violence, abuse, exploitation, and torture. And I think the panelists have done a superb job of taking us from, talking about drivers, talking about the investment case, the magnitude of the problem, and the fact that we have solutions to this. It's not an inevitable situation. I want to just share with you, I'm representing here a new global partnership to end violence against children, which is being created by partners, civil society partners, the brainchild, if I can say so, of UNICEF's executive director, Mr. Tony Lake, but in close association with WHO and a number of other partners. And this global partnership has a strategy to guide its first 5 years of existence, but it intends to accompany the 15 years of the Sustainable Development Goals to see if we can't really make a difference in the lives of children in fragile settings. But frankly, it's a test case for the universality of this new agenda. We've heard it on the panel and from those making remarks. The Global Partnership has 3 objectives, and the first, and again to my impatience, is maintaining and even growing the political will that we have to end violence against children. Again, not an inevitable situation. We have a package of interventions, and this is a shout out to WHO, to Together for Girls, the Center for Disease Control, PEPFAR, and UNICEF, of course. The strategies that have been deployed over the last 20 years, those of which have an evidence base, are being put into this package of interventions. Not something that you're going to take as a cookie-cutter approach to violence prevention, but some general principles that we can see have an impact on the lives of children. Things like early intervention and support to families, positive parenting, addressing social norms, services for victims, monitoring and evaluation and data, just to give you a glimpse of what is to come. And so building political will around the story and the evidence that things work. The second objective of the partnership is to accelerate national action. So in our strategy that you'll find on our website, we actually introduced the concept in the first 5 years of this partnership of pathfinder countries, early adopters of Agenda 2030, and those endorsing principles of rights focus and inclusivity in their work. And then third, the ambition of the partnership is to ignite a global movement. And I think that there are many pieces of that movement. And we heard Sunita, she had to go leave the room for a sound check, but she's a champion on this whole issue of child marriage, the outcomes of which are often, as she said already, sexual violence and violence against children, even if families didn't start out with that as their aim. And so those are the 3 objectives. And I just want to conclude by saying, someone asked, it was you, in fact, I think Evelyn asked the question about health. And I think approaches to keeping children safe, and I say this having worked with UNICEF on these issues for the last 26 years now, that approaches to keeping children safe have been fragmented and underfunded for so long, but they've always been in the purview of child protection, or those Bangladesh days we called it children in especially difficult circumstances. And keeping children safe is everybody's business, whether you're a doctor, a pediatrician, a teacher, a social worker, a member of the military forces. And I think what we're trying to do with this new partnership is get everybody at the table and look at where those investments can be made in those other sectors. We're not asking to divert everything to the social welfare workforce, though we know that needs to be strengthened. So with that, I want to thank my fellow panelists and urge all of you to visit our website, and to our colleagues from the bank, we look forward to working with you on this important endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. I think there's another session in here, so people are nodding. Yeah, thank you very much.